Hi friends, so today I'm going to talk about Chapter 3 of our Drugs and Behavior textbook titled Drug Policy. I'll be going over the first quarter of the chapter, which is roughly pages 45 through 52. So first I'm going to go over the introduction. So there weren't always federal regulations on drug use in the US. This lasted only for 2 years until 1791, when Congress passed a tax on whiskey, which then led to the Whiskey Rebellion. There are two classes of drug laws. One group of laws regulates the practices of pharmaceutical companies and others who manufacture or dispense legal drugs. The other group criminalizes certain types of drug use, possession, and sales. When laws are passed criminalizing drug behavior, there are two impacts. The first is symbolic, which is when those who support these laws benefit from the associations of supporting goodness, morality, and decency. The other is instrumental, which are the consequences to those affected by the implementation of the laws. Examples of this are the effects on budgets, the lives of those affected by the laws, police agencies, etc. Next, I'm going to talk about the beginning of drug policy, otherwise known as reformism. So current federal approaches to drug regulation in the US can be traced to three pieces of legislation passed between 1906 and 1918. The first is the Pure Food and Drugs Act, passed in 1906, which regulated pharmaceutical manufacturing and sales. The next is the Harrison Narcotics Act, passed in 1914, which regulated opioids and cocaine. And lastly, Prohibition, which was ratified in 1918 and implemented in 1919, which outlawed alcohol. So between 1890 and 1920, it was known as the nadir, or the lowest point of race relations in the US. This is when racism became more widespread. Many first labor unions were openly racist, as they tried to protect jobs for quote-unquote real Americans. Concerns about drunkenness, crime, drug misuse, and other deviant behavior was associated with minority groups, leading to laws regulating this behavior. So early drug policy actually can be traced back to racism, which is interesting. Next, I'm going to talk about issues leading to legislation. First, there's opium, which was used most notably as a pain reliever in the early 1800s. It was prescribed liberally with little concern about patients developing dependence. Americans and British traded opium with the Chinese, which led to the US's first treaty controlling international trade in opium in 1833. Then in the 1830s, there was a commercial production of pure morphine from opium. And then in the 1850s, the hypodermic syringe was introduced. This more potent delivery method led to medical recognition of the negative aspects of morphinism. Many patients developed dependence on morphine because of this. Next, there were patent medicines, which were medicines sold directly to the public under various trademark names. This occurred mostly before 1906, and the content of these medicines were concerning. Some were made of 44% alcohol, while others were 4% cocaine. And then next there was cocaine, which became available in the mid-1800s and increased over time. By 1900, it was present in many patent medicines and tonics, including the original Coca-Cola. And in the early 1900s, it was raised as an issue, as some Black people in the South began sniffing it, and it led to an increase in violent behavior. So now I'm going to talk about that first act, the 1906 Pure Food and Drugs Act. So it was inspired by the 1906 publication of The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, which exposed the unsanitary conditions in the meatpacking industry. So this act prohibited interstate commerce in adulterated or misbranded food and drugs. This brought the federal government full force into the drug marketplace. This act specifically referred to alcohol, morphine, opium, cocaine, heroin, and other agents. All ingredients had to be listed on any food or drug label, and the goal of this was to protect people from unscrupulous merchants, not themselves. Next was the Harrison Act of 1914. It was created by Dr. Hamilton Wright, who attended an international conference in 1912 to discuss controls on opium trade. This act imposed a special tax upon anyone who produce, import, manufacture, compound, deal in, dispense, or give away opium or coca leaves, their salts, and derivatives. Dealers and dispensers of opioids, cocaine, had to register manually and pay a small tax and use special forms. Now, some were concerned with how this would inconvenience physicians and pharmacists. However, Dr. Wright fought for this bill, often using racist defenses, such as that the Southern black men snorting cocaine could lead to raping white women, and other racist arguments. However, an important fact to remember is that individual use or possession of any drug was now criminalized by this law, and physicians were still free to prescribe heroin, cocaine, and other drugs. Next, I'm going to talk about the regulation of pharmaceuticals. So the 1906 Pure Food and Drugs Act called for the government to regulate the purity of both foods and drugs. So first there was the issue of purity. The Food and Drug Administration, also known as FDA, tested products and pursued any that were adulterated or didn't properly list important ingredients. This led to the 1912 Shirley Amendment, which outlawed false therapeutic claims on labels. And the FDA found that many violations of the 1906 law were unintentional and caused by poor manufacturing techniques and an absence of quality control measures. This led to the FDA developing techniques for various chemicals and products as they collaborated with pharmaceutical industries to improve standards. Next was the issue of safety. So in the 1930s, sulfa drugs were used as effective antibiotics. After finding that it could be given as a liquid if mixed with diethylene glycol, it was bottled and sold. It ended up causing kidney poisoning, and 107 people died from it. This led to, in 1938, drugs were required to be tested for toxicity before it could be marketed. Companies also had to submit an NDA, also known as a new drug application. The FDA now had to review every drug before it's marketed, which expanded the power and responsibility of the FDA. The last issue was effectiveness. So in 1962, the Kefauver-Harris amendments required the company seek approval before testing on humans in clinical trials. It also required that prescription drugs contain a summary about adverse reactions. It also required that every drug be demonstrated as effective for the illnesses mentioned on the label, and any drugs found ineffective by the FDA were removed from the market.